Three very creepy, rainy night horror stories. The rain poured relentlessly, hammering against the windows of Leora's small, secluded cottage. Normally, she would find comfort in the sound, a steady rhythm that soothed her restless mind. But tonight, the rain was different. It carried an unshakable weight, a chilling unease that made the air feel heavier with every passing moment. She sat curled up in her favorite chair, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The dim glow of the fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls, but even its warmth couldn't dispel the cold creeping into her bones. Her hands trembled as she held her tea, the mug's warmth a fragile barrier against the growing fear she couldn't quite place. Willow, her usually calm and lazy cat, was anything but relaxed. The gray tabby sat rigid on the windowsill, her ears twitching at every sound, every gust of wind, every creak of the house. Leora swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the tea. "What's wrong, Willow?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the relentless drum of rain. The cat didn't respond. Of course she didn't, but the way her tail swished, the way her wide eyes stayed fixed on the darkness outside, sent a shiver racing down Leora's spine, and then she heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. "Help me." Her breath caught in her throat. The mug slipped from her hands, crashing onto the floor and shattering into jagged pieces. She didn't even flinch. Her heart pounded, each beat a deafening drum in her ears. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky and uncertain. The only answer was the sound of rain, relentless and uncaring. Leora forced herself to her feet, her bare toes curling against the cool wooden floor. She moved toward the window, each step hesitant, her movements slow, as if the air itself resisted her. She pressed her face close to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Outside, the darkness seemed alive, shifting and pulsing with shadows that had no source. The porch light flickered, casting eerie shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared, and then again. "Please, help me." The voice was clearer now, closer. Leora's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her mind raced, battling between the urge to run and the desperate need to understand. Was someone out there, in this storm, alone? She reached for her phone on the nearby table, her fingers fumbling with the screen. No signal. Of course. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, there was rarely any reception. "Get a grip, Leora," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind, just the storm." But deep down, she didn't believe that. The voice came again, louder this time, and so heart-wrenchingly clear that it left no room for doubt. "Over here!" Her knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Against every ounce of common sense, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and pulled on her raincoat. The moment she opened the door, the cold rain lashed against her face, soaking her within seconds. The flashlight beam wavered as her hands shook, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Is someone there?" she called into the night, her voice almost swallowed by the storm. Silence. But then, movement. Just at the edge of the woods, something shifted. A figure? A shadow? Her heart leapt into her throat as she aimed the flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the curtain of rain. "Hello?" She tried again, her voice cracking. For a moment, nothing. And then, a sound that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, echoing against the earth as if the ground itself recoiled from the weight. Leora stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to lock the door and hide. But a small, fragile voice inside her whispered, "What if someone needs you?" Swallowing her fear, she forced herself to step off the porch and onto the muddy ground. The rain soaked through her boots, chilling her to the bone. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. "Don't leave me." Her flashlight flickered, its beam struggling against the darkness. She stepped closer to the woods, her heart hammering in her chest. "Where are you?" she called out, her voice trembling. The only response was the rustling of leaves and the rain's relentless patter. Then she saw it, a faint flickering light deeper in the trees. It swayed like a lantern, beckoning her forward. She hesitated, every fiber of her being screaming at her to turn back. But the light, it pulled her. Against her better judgment, she stepped into the woods. The air here was colder, the rain muffled by the thick canopy above. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The light moved deeper into the forest, and Leora followed, her footsteps hesitant. "Who's there?" she called, her voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The light flickered and vanished. Panic gripped her as she spun around, realizing too late that she didn't know which way she'd come. The path had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. "Hello?" she shouted, her voice breaking. And then she heard it. A whisper, so close, it felt like it was right beside her ear. "You shouldn't have come." Her scream caught in her throat as she turned wildly, the flashlight beam darting through the trees. Shadows danced around her, mocking her, closing in. "Stay with us." The voices overlapped now, rising in a chorus that echoed through the forest. They were everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. She ran, blindly, desperately. The branches clawed at her coat, the ground slippery beneath her feet. She stumbled, falling to her knees, her flashlight tumbling from her grip. Scrambling, she grabbed it, her hands slick with mud. The light flickered weakly, barely illuminating the trees around her. And then she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, their shapes barely human, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Stay," the voices whispered. With a scream, Leora bolted, her legs burning as she pushed herself forward. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape. When she burst out of the woods and onto her porch, she slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the door, her eyes darting around the room. It was quiet now, too quiet. Willow meowed softly, rubbing against her legs. She knelt down, clutching the cat to her chest, her tears mingling with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. But just as she began to calm, a sound echoed through the room, a soft, deliberate knock. She froze. Her eyes darted to the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a single wet handprint. This is most disturbing Rainy Night Horror Story number 2. The rain began softly, a gentle patter against the windows of the small, weathered cottage. To Marin, it was usually a soothing sound, one that wrapped her in a sense of calm and safety. But tonight, the rain felt different. It wasn't soothing. It was persistent, like fingers drumming on the glass. And it wouldn't stop. Marin sat curled up on her couch, her legs tucked beneath the warmth of a thick woolen blanket. The fireplace crackled, its golden light casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. She held a steaming cup of tea in her hands, but she wasn't drinking it. Her eyes kept drifting to the window. The power had gone out hours ago, plunging the cottage into darkness, save for the glow of the fire and a few scattered candles. Usually the stormy weather brought her peace. But tonight she felt exposed, vulnerable. The rain battered harder now, the wind howling as it whipped through the trees outside. It was loud, so loud that she almost missed it. The knock. At first, she thought it was her imagination. She froze, straining to hear over the storm. The clock on the mantel ticked louder than usual, each second dragging. Then it came again. Knock, knock. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone, or something, was at the door. Maybe it's the wind, she whispered to herself, though she didn't believe it. Placing the tea on the table, Marin stood, her bare feet brushing the cold wooden floor. Her heart hammered in her chest as she approached the door, every step slower than the last. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. Silence. The rain pounded harder. The wind screeched like a living thing, and then, knock, knock. It was sharper this time. She swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she reached for the lock. Slowly, cautiously, she cracked the door open. Rain sprayed in, icy and stinging against her face. But there was no one there. "Hello!" she called into the storm, her voice barely audible over the chaos. The only answer was the wind, her eyes lowered. That's when she saw them. Footprints. Muddy, elongated prints tracked across the porch. They led from the forest's edge to her door. A shiver ran down her spine. The prints didn't look human. They were long, narrow, and something about them was just wrong. She slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. Her breaths came in short gasps now as she backed away. The room felt smaller, the shadows darker. She tried to rationalize it. It had to be an animal. A stray, maybe, but deep down she knew better. Then it hit her. That sensation. The feeling of being watched. Her eyes darted to the window, the curtains drawn tight. For a moment she stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her imagination was running wild, wasn't it? Creak. The sound broke the silence. It wasn't outside. It was inside. Marin's heart nearly stopped. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she gripped the edge of the couch for balance. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice cracking. No response. Her gaze flicked toward the hallway. It was empty, dark and quiet, but the shadows felt alive, shifting as the firelight flickered. She grabbed the iron poker from the hearth, clutching it tightly as she edged toward the hallway. Her hands trembled, her breaths shallow. The hallway stretched before her, an eerie silence pressing down like a weight. The floor creaked beneath her feet. She swallowed hard, her grip tightening. And then she saw it. At the window. The silhouette. Tall. Thin. Motionless. It stood just outside the rain-streaked glass, its long limbs eerily still, its face hidden in the shadows. Marin's stomach twisted into knots, her mind racing, and then it moved. A hand, pale, unnaturally long, pressed against the window pane. The fingers splayed, impossibly thin. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her. "What? What do you want?" she screamed, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The figure didn't respond. It simply tilted its head, watching her. Then it tapped. Once, twice, 3 times. Marin stumbled back, her heart pounding as the poker slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. She turned and bolted, running into the kitchen. Her hands fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she tried to unlock it. No signal. "Please, no," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Not now." The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around her. She glanced back toward the living room, expecting to see the figure still at the window, but it wasn't. Creak. The sound came again. Closer. Inside the house. Marin's breath hitched as she spun around. Her vision blurred with fear, her chest heaving, and then it stepped into the light. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were grotesquely long, bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth, featureless, and pale as bone. Marin let out a strangled cry, backing into the counter as her knees buckled. The creature tilted its head again, almost curiously. It raised one of its bony hands and pointed toward the window. Her head whipped around. The window she had locked earlier was now open. Rain poured in, pooling on the floor. "I didn't open it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't." When she turned back, the figure was gone. The room spun. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running into the storm. The cold rain lashed against her skin as she sprinted toward the woods, her bare feet slipping in the mud. The wind howled around her, the trees towering like dark sentinels. But the feeling didn't leave. That heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched. She didn't stop running, not until the first light of dawn pierced the storm clouds. She stumbled onto the main road, soaked, trembling, and gasping for air. Marin never went back to the cottage, but even now, on stormy nights, she swears she can still feel it, the presence. And sometimes, just as she's drifting off to sleep, she hears it again, soft and deliberate. The sound of tapping on her window. This is most horrifying rainy night horror story number 3. The rain hammered relentlessly against the roof of the car, creating a deafening rhythm that matched the panic slowly rising in Jane's chest. The road stretched out before her, a lonely ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkened countryside. It was so quiet, too quiet. Just the sound of the storm and her breathing. The clock on the dashboard blinked, 12:07 a.m. Jane hadn't seen another vehicle in miles. The road felt unnervingly deserted tonight, unnaturally quiet, and then the tension that had been building in the pit of her stomach deepened. The rain seemed to come down harder. The windshield wipers were struggling, swishing back and forth in futile attempts to clear the deluge. Jane's hands were clenched tightly around the wheel, her knuckles pale, the tightness of her grip matching the pressure building in her chest. The sound of the rain seemed louder now, filling her ears. She tried to focus on the road ahead, but a flash of lightning illuminated the trees, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something. Someone. Her heart skipped. A figure standing among the trees, so still, so unnatural. She blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the thought. but it wouldn't leave. Her eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, but the road was empty. It had to be her imagination. Had to be. Taking a deep breath, Jane reached for the radio, turning the dial. But all she got was static. She let out a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the unease creeping over her. "Come on, Jane, get it together," she muttered under her breath, but the words felt hollow, an attempt to convince herself. And then, as the lightning split the sky once again, she saw it. A figure. A woman, standing in the middle of the road, completely motionless, as if waiting. Jane slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet road. The car lurched forward, coming to a stop just inches away from the figure. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart slamming against her chest as she stared at the woman, so still. The woman's clothes were drenched, clinging to her body. Her pale face, framed by dark, wet hair, was turned toward the car. And then Jane realized she was pointing straight toward the passenger side of the car. Jane's mind raced. What? Her voice was shaky, almost lost in the downpour, but she called out to the woman, "Are you okay? What are you doing out here?" The woman didn't answer right away. She just kept pointing, her finger trembling in the rain. Jane's pulse raced. Something wasn't right. She couldn't just drive away, could she? She hesitated for a moment, but then, against every instinct that told her to drive off, she unlocked the passenger door. "Get in," Jane said, her voice shaky, louder this time. She quickly rolled down the window. The woman didn't waste a second. She moved slowly, almost unnaturally slowly, as though she was gliding across the wet pavement. Her face, drenched in rain, was emotionless, her eyes vacant. Jane couldn't look away. Her breath fogged up the window as the woman slid into the seat beside her. Cold, freezing. The air inside the car seemed to drop in temperature. Jane felt a chill creeping up her spine. "Thank you," the woman whispered. Her voice was barely audible, a breathy, hollow sound that sent a shiver crawling across Jane's skin. Jane swallowed hard, trying to calm her nerves, but the atmosphere in the car was thick, heavy. Something was wrong. "Where are you headed?" Jane asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but it wavered. The woman didn't immediately respond. She just stared ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. A pause, stretching too long, filled the space between them. The silence was oppressive. The seconds felt like minutes. "Are you lost?" Jane pressed, though she knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "I'm waiting," the woman said softly, her voice distant. "Waiting?" Jane repeated, trying to catch her breath. The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, her gaze drifted to the side window, staring out into the storm, her face eerily still. Empty. Jane's stomach twisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that this woman wasn't really here, that something wasn't right. The tension in the car was so thick, so palpable, that it felt suffocating. Jane kept glancing at the clock. 12:20 a.m., 15 minutes. It felt like an eternity. "Are you okay?" Jane asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman turned to her, and for a second Jane saw something flicker in her eyes, something dark. But it was gone before she could make sense of it. The woman smiled, a faint, unsettling grin that never quite reached her eyes. "You shouldn't stop for strangers," she said softly. The words sent a cold shiver down Jane's spine. Her pulse quickened. "I was just trying to help," Jane said, trying to convince herself more than the woman. "It's not safe out there. You were standing in the rain." The woman's lips curled upward, her smile widening just a little too much. Too wide, too empty. "Not everyone is who they seem," she whispered. The car grew colder, the air thicker. Jane's breath fogged up the windshield. She felt dizzy, disoriented. Every time she looked at the woman, her unease grew stronger. "I think I should drop you off here," Jane said quickly, the words escaping before she could think. The woman didn't react immediately. Her gaze was still locked on Jane, but there was something else in the air, a feeling of dread that settled like a weight in Jane's chest. She reached for the handle, but her fingers froze. Something was wrong. "I'm not going to hurt you," the woman finally said, her voice low and calm. Too calm. "But you're already in too deep." Jane's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, panic rising in her throat. What did she mean? The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. Before Jane could react, she pulled the car to the side of the road, her hands trembling. "Stop here." Now she couldn't drive any further, but when she glanced at the woman, her seat was empty. Empty. No sign of her. Not a trace. Jane's breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, searching the back seat, the rear view mirror. Nothing. "Hello," she called, her voice cracking. Nothing. A knock. A sudden, sharp knock on the window. Jane jerked her head around, but no one. The glass fogged up, and there, pressed against it, was the woman's face. Her eyes, black, hollow. "Let me in," she whispered. Jane's hand shot toward the door lock, but she stopped. She froze. Her chest tightened, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "No," she whispered. But the woman's smile widened, too wide. "You already did." And just like that, the woman was back in the passenger seat, silent, still, staring. The rain continued to pour down, and the car was swallowed by the storm. But something had shifted. The world was different now. And so was Jane.